All right, so I will say, well, first of all, I want to thank the Heretics Club for having me. I'm a huge fan of the Heretics Club, and I'm always very happy to be part of this. I do have to say that I teach at 1:20, so I'm going to leave like right at 1:15, and my apologies for that. So I originally, as I thought about, this is a topic that is kind of dear to my heart. It's very much at the, how should I put this? Like, the research and teaching that I do very much on a regular basis involves listening really seriously and carefully to people with whom I have significant political and ideological differences. So this is a topic that I could talk about for a really long period of time, especially because I feel like the fact of when I initially went into doing research on some of the things that I study, I just sort of assumed that there was a kind of inherent value that everybody would recognize in like taking your opponent seriously. But it turns out like that's not a universally recognized value at all. And in fact, I've been called to task many, many times by, people who I think of as really smart people to like explain how I can live with myself or something like that. So I think so I have a lot to say about this. But because I teach at 1:20 and because I actually want to get through what I want to say, and I also want to kind of hear people's thoughts, not just like directed toward me, but like all of us as a group. I'd love to have us like have a conversation about a topic that I think is really important. So for that reason, I'm going to I decided I'm going to keep it a little bit short, and I'm going to put some stuff up on PowerPoint because that will like make me have to be kind of short or something. So I guess the first thing that I would say, I kind of hinted at this already. Like I don't necessarily like know what I'm talking about here. Like this is stuff that I have been involved in for a long. This is a kind of position that I've been in as a teacher and a scholar for a long period of time, but it's not necessarily something I'm totally comfortable with, right? I mentioned that I've been kind of called to task in a number of different ways by people. I literally, over spring break, was in the United Kingdom. I was in Scotland, and I'm working on this article. And the article is basically, it's going to be a book chapter, and it's an article that's looking at the question of why certain Americans like don't like human rights, like why human rights make certain Americans uncomfortable. And so I was like using my time in the UK as anybody would, like sitting in a coffee shop doing work, which is a totally sad way to use your time when you're in the United Kingdom. But I was sitting in a coffee shop, looking over web pages from sort of like far right American kind of ethno-nationalist groups, and as I was doing it, I was like trying to cover the screen also at the same time because I was in a coffee shop, and I was in the United Kingdom, and I just figured it was only a matter of time before somebody would walk past and be like, "What are you like? Who are you?" And so again, like I'm just going to acknowledge like the discomfort that I have. I think just the inherent kind of discomfort that I have about some of this stuff. That said, I think it's super important, and that's why I will talk about it, even though I think that there are lots and lots of potential kind of points of discomfort about this. But this, I guess the first thing I want to do is raise a different point, which is this semester's Heretics series is about authenticity, right? So that's kind of like the guiding theme for this semester, and so I was trying to kind of think about how what I'm talking about is related to authenticity. And what I'll say is, I actually think it is really related to a particular kind of authenticity. So here's what I'm thinking about. When it comes to understanding people with different perspectives, I think that there's a certain kind of authenticity that often kind of surfaces. And it's an authenticity that looks something like this. Like, okay, I listen to what you have to say, the person that I disagree with, and I listen long enough to conclude that now I know what's really going on. Like I have figured out like what's authentically going on with you. What's authentically going on with you is that you're like a hypocrite, right? Or you're irrational, or you're a bigot. And therefore, I've done my due diligence, and now I've kind of like unearthed like the real authentic you. And I shall now like condemn you, right? And that's a kind of, it's an interesting kind of authenticity, right? It's a kind of like Enlightenment authenticity, right? This idea that like, shedding a harsh light upon others is the way to like truly understand them. I think that's the kind of authenticity I want to like push against a little bit, actually. This idea that knowledge, like the most important knowledge that we can gain about people comes through like debunking people, right? Debunking people or disabusing people of their ideas that we find repugnant, right? Like, and so that's kind of what I want to think about, right? That idea of authenticity as a kind of a sense that we're getting to the real thing beneath the facade, of irrationality or bigotry or whatever that people are kind of putting up to defend what they're really all about. So I want to push against this type of authenticity, and I want to talk about some reasons why I'm not going to make the claim that everybody's opinion is right? That's I'm not kind of going in the direction of relativism here. But I do want to make the case for why it's a good idea, I guess what I would say, it's a good idea to suspend that impulse, that kind of authenticity. By suspended, I mean to back off of that a little bit when dealing with people that you disagree with, just for a little bit, right? You can still do it, you can still judge, right? But why might it be a good idea to step back and not immediately search for the thing that's going to allow you to debunk somebody else, right, or to label somebody else as kind of not worth listening to. And so my plan is that I'm going to offer up 8 reasons why I think why it's good to push against this kind of authenticity, right? The kind of authenticity I was talking about, the debunking authenticity. So 8 reasons why it's a good idea to take your opponent seriously, and then I'm just going to open it up for questions and comments, and we'll see how long it takes for somebody to raise the question about whether or not I would take Hitler seriously, because that's pretty much where these conversations tend to go eventually, right? Is well, you're basically saying that you would be okay with Hitler, right? And so, you know what I mean? There's this whole thing about the 6 degrees, the 6 degrees of separation, where if you just look hard enough, you can find 6 people that connect you to Kevin Bacon or something like that. There's also this kind of 6 degrees until a reference to Hitler gets made in political discourse, right? All it takes is just a couple. There's a couple steps down the road before somebody invokes Hitler, right? As the kind of ultimate sort of shutdown. So we'll see how long it takes us to get there. Okay, taking your opponent seriously. Why? All right. So the first reason I think it's important involves education, right? Critical thinking is something that at least you students, I think you get a lot of, from the moment of your orientation here at Colgate, people talk about critical thinking, how important it is, and it's obviously this really great thing and really valuable. People disagree about what critical thinking is, but one thing that I would say is, in my mind, critical thinking is not thinking about something long enough to dismiss it, right? Not just figuring out how to dismiss something. And interestingly enough, I do think that's something that kind of stands in for critical thinking a lot of times in the classroom. You're dealing with really difficult materials, right? They're hard to kind of wrap your mind around. And one of the easiest ways to kind of critically engage something is to say oh, that's a white man from 1909, and therefore we shouldn't be reading this, right? That's this is written by an overt Christian, and Christians are inherently biased, and therefore why are we reading this, right? By the way, students have said that to me in religion classes. It's a class where we're studying religion, and students will say why are we reading Martin Luther? He's a Christian and he's biased. You're in a religion class. So anyway, that's what I mean by critical thinking, right? Sure, there are all kinds of reasons to critically examine the kinds of things that you come into contact with, but I think it's a lazy critique to just find the first thing that you can find that seems like a viable grounds to dismiss something and then just immediately dismiss the whole kind of product. So that's the first reason, and I have a quote here from David Frum. I went up for tenure last semester, and I literally put this quote in my statement of tenure. This was one of the arguments I made to Colgate as to why it's okay that I do what I do. Okay, so Frum says, "You do not need to be a partisan of a political movement to write its history, but you do need enough imaginative sympathy to comprehend how it won adherents and supporters." Right? Again, to engage with imaginative sympathy with groups that have made particular political decisions is not the same thing as endorsing those political decisions, but it goes a long way toward actually understanding why people have done what they've done, right? In fact, I would argue you can't understand why a political movement galvanizes people in particular ways unless you really do give some thought to how things look on the terms of those people who are being galvanized in that way. Okay? So education, number 1. The second reason is self-awareness. I think it's harder to be lazy with your own convictions when you spend time thinking deeply about other people's convictions, especially people that you disagree with, right? It represents more of a challenge to yourself. when you take seriously other people's opinions, especially the ones that you find really uncomfortable for whatever reason. That doesn't mean that you relinquish your own opinions. If anything, I think you become stronger in your own opinions when you take the time to really think carefully about others' opinions, because it forces you then to make good reasons to yourself about why it is that you hold the positions that you hold and not other types of positions. Okay, so self-awareness is another thing. Another reason I think it's important to take your opponent seriously involves power. And what do I mean by that? We all, in every context that we're involved in, but I'm thinking specifically about like educational contexts and political contexts, we all live in contexts where, in which certain opinions and ideas are hegemonic. Okay? What do I mean by hegemonic? Hegemonic refers to the idea of ruling or dominant in a particular social or political context, right? Like every context that we navigate, again, especially educational and political context, involves certain kinds of hegemonic ideas. Ideas that are the ruling and dominant ideas, and the ones that people tend to just take for granted, right? And that's fine, right? That's totally fine. Sometimes ideas are hegemonic because they're the best ones, right? Like people, they tend to be dominant because they're like good. Like people have worked through, like years and years, and like the best has won out. Sometimes ideas are hegemonic because they just happen to be the ideas and opinions that are shared by most people, right? And there's a difference between those two things, okay? Just because an idea is hegemonic doesn't mean it's good, right? It could just be hegemonic because most people happen to believe that. And it's very, you all in your lives are going to navigate situations like this where there will be ideas that are more or less taken for granted. And I think that taking your opponent seriously can be one way of pushing against, kind of disentangling that question about that I just posed, right? Disentangling that dichotomy. Is the idea hegemonic because it's good, or is the idea hegemonic because it just happens to be the thing that most people think is like the best idea, right? It's very hard to, like I think there's a lot about our psychology that makes us resistant to thinking about those kinds of things until we encounter ideas and notions that push against that, from the outside. Okay. The fourth thing is perspective. The same issue can look very different depending upon the kinds of things that people are bringing to the issue. That's a totally obvious thing to say, but I think it's worth thinking about, right? The kinds of frameworks that you bring, like your background, the kinds of ways of thinking about the world that you bring to the table, the priorities that you have, all of those things can turn a real situation into something that looks quite different between different people. So the notion, again, going back to that kind of idea that I said about authenticity, right? This notion that there's sort of like a real world, right? An authentic world, and what authenticity is like figuring out what the real world is. I think misses the fact that much of the reality of the world that people live in is shaped by like very different perspectives that they have, and it's a good idea to pay attention to other people's perspectives in that respect. Okay. The fifth thing is equity. Okay, what do I mean by equity? Somebody told me this a long time ago, and it was random. It was just at a conference, but it really made an impression on me. A man that I was talking to had said that he makes it a point never to compare his best to someone else's worst, right? Like you don't evaluate somebody based upon that worst part of them, and like in comparison to the best part of yourself. At the very least, right, if you're going to evaluate somebody, you should try to think of what their best is, right? That doesn't mean that people always live up to their best, but nevertheless, right, thinking about like what's the best, like what's the kind of what would be the way of thinking about what they're doing in a sense that isn't just immediately seeking out their worst and then like comparing to my best, right? We all fall short of like our best. And I think that this is another really important reason to take opponents seriously, and this kind of didn't show up here, sorry. This is a quote just from a New York Times article very recently. It takes a generous spirit to imagine sympathetic circumstances motivating other people's behavior, especially when what they're doing upsets me, right? That idea of imagining sympathetic circumstances motivating other people's behavior, I think is really important, right? It's a matter of, again, it's a matter of equity, but it's also an important way of like understanding the world better. Okay. Next, empathy. I put this one kind of down the list because here's the place where I think like the Hitler thing comes from, right? When I say like it's a matter of empathy that you should listen to your opponents, that's when people say like, oh, so you're saying like, terrible people should be treated with empathy, right? And everybody knows that that's not a good idea. I find this one to be a really hard one, so I just buried it. I buried the lead, whatever, put it down in the list. But now here it is, I have to talk about it, right? Empathy doesn't mean sympathy, okay? Just to be clear, right? Empathy, if anything, empathy involves like extending your imagination in such a way that you can understand, right? You could conceive, to go back to this quote, right? Extending yourself and your imagination in such a way that you can imagine sympathetic circumstances for people, motivating people. That's not the same thing as sympathizing for people, okay? So when I say empathy, I don't necessarily mean like we should sympathize with everybody, right? We should, like, no matter who they are, we should sympathize with everybody. But I think one of the things one of the reasons I put this one lower down, and one of the things that makes me more uncomfortable about the idea of empathy is, I mean, I have no problem with this idea of empathy. I'm like secure in my empathy, but one of the things that I think is interesting is like a lot of times people will say, well, what about people who aren't empathetic back, right? Like why should I be empathetic towards somebody who's like not going to be the same way toward me, right? Somebody who doesn't respect my right to my dignity or my my right to live in the way that I want to live, and like I get that. I totally understand that. At the same time, like, do you want to just put yourself on that level as well, right? Like the fact that you might be dealing with somebody who won't give you empathy, is that a reason for you then also to retract, kind of retract your empathy from your opponents? I don't think it is a good enough reason. If anything, I think it's kind of a matter of being the bigger person in that situation, right? So if anything, I think like a person's lack of reciprocal empathy might be a reason to really double down on that empathy, right? Just on principle, rather than to say like from the beginning, like these people are not empathetic. I'm not gonna give them my empathy. And there are all kinds of like much richer sort of theological and moral frameworks for making exactly the same argument, right? This idea of like do unto others as you would have done unto you. And I'm just going to keep it like in a totally like not as eloquent lexicon, I guess. Okay, number 7, politics. We live in an incredibly divisive and divided political context right now. I don't have to tell you this, right? It's like a regular thing for people to demonize and dismiss people with whom they disagree. And I think like probably nobody in this room requires convincing that that's like not a productive way to engage in the kind of negotiations and communications that are necessary to live, to run a productive, political world. So why be part of that problem, right? Like, I mean, there's a pretty easy way. It's not a solution, but there's at least a pretty easy way to start to not be part of the problem, right? Which would be to not immediately seek to demonize and dismiss people with whom you disagree, right? Again, it's not a solution, but at least you're not being part of the problem. And then finally, I would say there's the fact of principle, right? And how do I talk about principle? It's related to some of these other things as well, I guess I would say. But to talk about it, I think what I really want to do is just go right to a quote. Okay, so this is a quote from a couple of my students who are here from Church and State. So this will be familiar to you because I just can't. I like harp on this, right? But this is a quote from a Supreme Court case from 1943, and the background of this case is actually really interesting. Okay, it involves something that I think today we would universally say is like not important. Okay. So it involves, do you remember, Sydney? It's not mean of me to like, it's okay if you don't remember. Sydney was in my class like 20 years ago. So anyway, all right. So it involves the question of whether, I see some other people in here too. No, I'm just kidding. So it involves the question of whether a school can force kids to salute the flag, right? So to engage in the Pledge of Allegiance and the flag salute. And in the 1940s, this was a really important question. Okay, now why is it important? Like, who cares whether kids salute the flag? In the 1940s, it was a really, really important question. This is during World War II, right? And this is during a period of intense sort of American nationalism and intense efforts to sort of use the public schools as a vehicle for generating patriotism and good citizenship in impressionable minds, right? And then those impressionable minds would turn out to, kind of go off and be good citizens. And there was a group of people in the 1940s who refused to salute the flag, okay? And this was a group called the Jehovah's Witnesses. You all know who they are, right? They're the ones who knock on doors periodically. They knock on people's doors and people tell them that they're having dinner or somebody's deathly ill in the family and they have to close the door immediately, right? And they can't talk to the Jehovah's Witnesses. So anyway, this involved the Jehovah's Witnesses. So the Jehovah's Witnesses have a deep conviction that one of the most important rules for a Christian to follow is the prohibition on idolatry. Okay? And idolatry is the idea of worshiping false idols. Okay? So for Jehovah's Witnesses, the idea of saluting the flag essentially amounts to worshiping of the state, right? Putting the state above God, or dividing your loyalty, right, between God and the state, which is unacceptable. Okay, so these kids are young. These were like 9 and 11-year-old kids who refused to do this. And at the time that this was happening, there's a really the kids who eventually turned into adults did interviews and whatnot. They both passed away now, but some of the original Jehovah's Witness kids talked about actually being forced bodily to salute the flag. So they were the one little girl talks about like her brother holding onto his pants, and the teacher like forcefully like pulling his arm up and making him salute the flag. It was really important, right? It was deeply important. In 1940, the Supreme Court heard a case where they basically said, sorry, Jehovah's Witnesses, like there's a more important interest at stake here, and that is creating the kind of unity that's important for, kind of building the foundations of a democratic society, right? If you don't have that patriotic unity, then you don't have things like free exercise of religion in the first place, right? And so you have to do this. And then 3 years later, the court reversed itself, which is a very unusual move to make. And this is from that case when the court ended up reversing itself. But there were still enough people on the court, and certainly there were enough Americans outside, like beyond the walls of the court, who considered the flag salute to be the absolute, like one of the core features of the production of patriotism and national unity, right? A core feature. So again, think back to what I said about hegemony, right? Like hegemonic ideas. A lot of people thought this was a good idea. That we can debate whether or not that really was a good idea, but the fact is that lots of people thought it was. Okay, so the court here is explaining why it has reversed its position, and just Robert Jackson, who dissented in the original opinion, now steps up and gets to write the majority opinion, and he says something that again inspires a lot of the work. I've actually quoted this in probably too many articles that I've written. And it says, freedom to differ is not limited to things that do not matter much. That would be a mere shadow of freedom. The test of its substance, that is the test of the substance of the freedom to differ, is the right to differ as to things that touch the heart of the existing order, right? So this is kind of Jackson's way of saying something that I said at the beginning, which is, if it's easy for you to listen to somebody that you disagree with, then the stakes are probably not that high, right? Like, it's the things that people say that you find most bothersome that might be the things that you should give a little bit of time to. Again, that's not the same thing as saying endorsing things, right? But that idea, the kind of principle that freedom to differ can't just pertain to the things that we find really easy to differ about, right? That, as Jackson says, is a shadow of freedom. That's not real freedom to differ. Real freedom to differ comes out in our ability to listen and differ with people that we profoundly disagree with. And if we can't live up to that, then we're not really living up to the principle of the freedom to differ. Okay? So I'll just say really briefly. Oh, good, we still have plenty of time to talk. So I guess the point, like my kind of takeaway with this would be to say that what I would say more than anything else is like what I'm advocating for is like pulling up short, right? Like pulling up short in our desire to debunk, right? In our desire to sort of see like the real world. And to think carefully about the kind of whether or not the real stuff that we're looking for is just stuff that like seems really reasonable to us and like logical to us, or even more seems like the kind of general opinion that everybody else holds, right? And a very good way of doing that is to take your opponent seriously. That is not the same thing as giving your opponents a free pass, right? Like after you've done the pulling back and sitting with ideas, you can still step up then and say, you're wrong, right? And here, but at least then you can say, here are the reasons that you're wrong, right? Here's where you're coming from, and here are the reasons why you're wrong about what it is you're thinking about. I don't see this kind of position as a capitulation to like relativism. And then the final takeaway I would say is something that I already said with regard to this quote, right? The harder the ideas, the more you might want to resist that inclination not to sit with those ideas and think about them. So I'll leave it at that, and I'd be happy to take questions. Again, I don't really think of questions just kind of coming my way, but I would love to like hear people's thoughts on this issue. So thanks for listening.